I'd also very much like to thank the European Coalition for Corporate Justice for taking initiative to this interesting and extremely timely conference on business and human rights and corporate accountability. So I would like to reiterate that 1 month ago France passed a law on corporate duty of vigilance, and this law puts on the legal obligations on business to ensure respect for human rights throughout their activities and business relationships. And this topic is at the centre of the business and human rights debate. In the past years, this question has gained an important political momentum. There are initiatives to improve corporate accountability, and the number of them has increased at national, European and at international levels. The law in France shows that respect for human rights and the environment can be legally mandated into business activities, but it is not the only example. Just 2 weeks ago, we reached a major breakthrough in responding to the problem of conflict minerals. We will have a binding legislation that obliges firms involved in the extraction and trade of minerals to check whether their supply chain has links to armed conflicts and human rights abuses. The conflict mineral legislation is not perfect, but even despite its shortcomings, the key point is that the Commission and Council originally aimed for voluntary self-certification measures, but voluntary means were not enough for this Parliament, and it should not be enough for the European citizens. So the French corporate duty of vigilance law and the conflict minerals regulation are just first steps. They are examples for binding legislation on corporate responsibility for other sectors and producers. But we already have other things coming. Last week, the Development Committee of the European Parliament voted on an EU flagship initiative on the garment sector. The outcome of the votes was excellent. Once again, the committee calls on the Commission to present a legislative proposal on mandatory due diligence obligations, this time to garment and footwear sectors. And next week in Strasbourg, we will also vote on the report on palm oil and deforestation. Here we see the same thing happening again. The European Parliament is calling for an action plan on deforestation and forest degradation. This action plan should include concrete regulatory measures to ensure that no supply chains and financial transactions that lead to EU result in deforestation and forest degradation. Another key demand in the palm oil report is that the European Union should have a mandatory regulatory framework that would ensure that all agricultural commodity importers' supply chains are traceable back to the origin of the raw material. That is an interesting demand because traceability of the raw materials is important not only in the context of the palm oil but also with garments and food imports, for example. So we can start with sector-specific initiatives such as the ones we are having now, conflict minerals, garments, palm oil. These initiatives and sector-specific legislations are like dots we need to connect with lines and create general obligations. I think that the Commission is also present here, and my next words are especially for the Commission. I find myself often reading Commissioner Malmström's Trade for All communication. It says very clearly that trade policy must take responsibility for supporting and promoting EU values and to engage with partners to promote human rights, labour rights and environmental protection. As you see, we in this Parliament are already trying to connect the dots and ask the Commission to provide us a mandatory due diligence and corporate accountability provisions. We don't want to support and promote human rights only in the EU but in the whole global value chain, and we see that the trade policy can be a mighty tool for that. So, while the Parliament is doing as much as it can, I have two requests to the Commission. Firstly, a year ago the Commission hinted on an EU action plan on responsible business conduct. This action plan could show that the Commission and the EU really stand by its words. And the second request is not so much about mandatory human rights due diligence, but on the other aspect of human rights and business. When the Commission is drafting and planning the multilateral investment court that is supposed to replace the current investment protection system, why not really make it trade for all, not just for the privileged few? We could really make a difference if we first would make sure that human rights, environmental rights and sustainable development chapters are as binding, as enforceable as the investment protection chapters in our trade agreements. And when there are violations, also the victims would have an access to this international court, not just corporations and investors. That I could call a trade for all. So thank you very much, and let's open our discussions for today.